7 or 8 months ago, yeah, 8 months ago, we started this YouTube podcast. The vocabulary on this isn't very elegant. You call it a podcast. Nobody,
It's not
I'm
even on a pod. We don't
no one even knows. I
it's a
mean,
show.
80%
show.
of the people, of the youngsters under 30, probably don't even know why a podcast is called a podcast.
I never thought about that, but I think you're probably right.
Right?
Yeah.
It just had to do with this nutty first contraption, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and
So
also
anyway, and our goal is to talk to people who are interesting and have something useful to say. And I thought, gee, Mark is one of those people, and you've got a new book and everything.
Well, I'm honored, and I'm not sure if I qualify as interesting, but I'm very happy to be here, and yeah, I'd love to talk about the book and whatever else may be
now
on your mind.
You've been pre-screened as interesting, so you don't have to worry about that. Let us qualify you.
We're good to go. All right.
All right. Now, I know you know my background, Mark, but you don't know Julia's background, and that's the combination of our two backgrounds. I think is what makes us a little better than average interviewers. So, Julia, what's your background?
Yeah, sure. Largely academia, cognitive neuroscience, experimental psychology, specifically focused on perception, a little behavior, and then in the last 10 years, a lot of technology. So creating AI, creating data-informed technological solutions for trying to help people live better lives, focus on well-being, and making the world a better place.
And for
I'm all for that.
For some strange reason, Julia, about 4 years ago, declared her interest in associating her skills and expertise more with the national security intelligence community.
Excellent.
And well, no, I said, no, stay away.
Yeah, Carmen was very discouraging. She was like a rabbi when you want to convert.
Oh,
it's good. It's like, are you sure? Yes. Are you sure?
But, here we are 4 years later, and she's actually made a lot of progress. And not as much as she would want to, but a lot.
Well,
that's okay.
That's always the case, I think.
Yeah. So anyway, that's Julia's story. That's my story. And so, Mark, why don't you introduce yourself, Mark Stout, to
good heavens.
to our listeners? So you have a new book out, and you are a scholar. You have a PhD, correct?
Yes, I have a PhD in history, and these days I identify as an intelligence historian. But like a lot of people actually in the intelligence studies or intelligence history fields, I also have a background as a practitioner. So I worked in the national security world for 21 years, of which 13 were doing intel and another 6 were doing some intel adjacent stuff. In the Intelligence Committee, I was at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research for 8 years. And then I was 5 years at the CIA in what was then the Directorate of Intelligence, now the Directorate of Analysis.
Right.
And all this time, aside from 1 year as a staff guy, all that time I was either an analyst, mostly actually working on Russia, though I'm not a Russia expert anymore at all, or a first line manager of analysts. And in between careers 1 and 2, I was the historian at the International Spy Museum in Washington for 3 years, which was great fun. During that time, I was working on a PhD in history, which many years later has evolved into my book, which I have here.
Okay, so your book is your PhD.
World War I. Yeah, literally entirely rewritten. But yes, World War I and the Foundations of American Intelligence. I rewrote every single paragraph. And for several years, I ran a master's program for Johns Hopkins in global security studies, and now I'm semi-retired, and I do a little adjunct teaching, and I write.
So you're not doing the Johns Hopkins things anymore, but you still have the email address.
Yes, I officially retired from Hopkins, which only takes 10 years of continuous service as faculty member, which means I get a lifetime email address.
Nice.
So yes, it's where I do most of my professional and academic stuff, mostly, is on that email.
So, the First World War it was a momentous war.
Yeah.
And I read a book once by the historian. Let me see if I have his name right. Paul Fussell.
Yeah, I think it's Fussell, but I'm actually not
Oh,
entirely
yeah,
sure.
and it's the Great War and
Great War and Modern Memory, right? I read that as a freshman.
There you go. And I read that book 25 years ago, and I was quite taken by the tragedy of World War I and its lasting impact on how the humans think about what the world can be like, right? So all these, like the word decimate. I remember this from the book. The word decimate, which means to kill 1 out of every 10, wasn't really used until World War I, at least not used in journalism and things like that. But then the journalists kind of discovered it to describe the level of, pointless killing that occurred in World War I.
Geez, I mean, gosh, I mean, that when I'm sorry, I'm having this reaction.
Yes, no, you should. You should.
I'm having a reaction that it's like so many times when I talk to people about, well, what would it be like to try to create conditions for a no war future? What would that be like? I don't say world peace, I just say a no war future. And I often come back with like, well, war is it's a human trait. We're just gonna do it. But now I think like, oh, maybe it's only like 100 years old. That kind of war.
Well, that kind of war. What do you think? What was the first war that really? I mean, I think maybe the U.S. Civil War.
Well, what's the question? There are many wars that are answers to many questions.
Well, I was going to say, what's the first modern war? In terms of killing. What a horrible standard to use, but nevertheless, there we are.
Well, with regard to actual casualties, if you want to take them as, say, a percentage of the warring populations or something, I'm not sure. You're probably back in the Middle Ages sometime, when, for a good candidate would be when the Mongolians took over, much of what is the modern Middle East, for instance. But to slightly tweak the question, there's some discussion among historians, and I'm largely agnostic on this question, as to whether the first modern war really is the U.S. Civil War. And they point to the widespread military use of railroads and of the telegraph, and of machine guns, early proto machine guns, but Gatling guns, and that sort of thing. There are historians, however, who argue that there's much more continuity with the past on that war than the present. Another strong candidate is the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871. Yeah, and of course the Prussians were tremendous military innovators in the 19th century. Including in intelligence, by the way, though by no means exclusively. So, as I say, not entirely entitled to an opinion, but that would probably be my candidate. But then you see it flowering. That's the wrong word because it suggests it's a pleasant thing. You see it developing, particularly in the Russo-Japanese War, from which the Western powers drew all the wrong lessons. I mean, much of that war actually looked very much like what was going to happen in the Western Front in France. But the lesson that a lot of European powers took from that was, if you had sufficient willpower, as the Japanese did, you can defeat the barbed wire and the machine guns. And that was not the right lesson to draw from that war. And then, of course, World War I, it's going in all directions. And I think there's a real sort of, not inflection point, there's a sharp bend in the curve, if you will, in World War I, with all sorts of things going on. And everything that I just mentioned in the Civil War, but also the advent of radio used for military purposes, and which leads us also to something looking like today's modern signals intelligence, plus aerial reconnaissance. They were rickety, but airplanes flew and they carried cameras and provided whole new levels of awareness of what was going on the battlefield to commanders. So one of the arguments that I make in my book with regard to intel, but others have made with regard to war just generally, is that if you take an officer from the U.S. military, the British military, in November 1918, the day the war ended on the 11th, those people could have a perfectly good professional conversation with officers of World War II or even into the Cold War.
Right.
The officers of 1914, however, could not. They were moving towards where we are today, but they were much more sort of reminiscent of, Franco-Prussian War than they were of World War II or Korea or let alone Vietnam.
One
So,
of the books I've read, occasionally I do read books about military history and things like that. One of them was called, or is called, The Tsar's Last Armada.
oh,
And it
yeah,
is the
I know
story.
of it. I've never read it. Yeah.
It's the story of the Battle of the Tsushima. I'm not sure I'm saying that
Tsushima,
correct.
yeah, Battle of
Tsushima
Tsushima, right?
Straits. So what happened to the Russians, and the reason why I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on this is because ever since I read that book, I think about it whenever I think about Taiwan, China, because
Yes.
to me, it seems to be the same scenario, or
Similar,
many parts of the
analogous.
same scenario. So what happened is that the Japanese defeated the Russia's Pacific Navy very early in the war. And, Russia's huge, and they have to have a Navy on this side, and they have to have a Navy on that side. So to reclaim their territory and defeat the Japanese, the Tsar had to send an armada all the way, or basically around Africa, across the Indian Ocean, all the way up to this little strait of sea that sort of protected, you could only access it from the south or from the north. And as soon as this huge armada entered the Sea of Japan, they were like destroyed like in a day, in less than a
Crushed.
day.
Wow.
By the Japanese Navy. I mean,
They had no antibodies to that.
It's incredible. And when you read, much of the book is just discussing how they got there, because back then, you had to supply your ships. And so there was always an issue of whether or not they would be able to port and coal up and, get the stuff they needed to keep going. It takes them months to get there. The battle ends in 8 hours or something like that. And I'm just shaking my head thinking,
yeah,
it's very difficult to fight a war when you are that far away from your resources.
Yeah, absolutely. I've just been reading a book called War Plan Orange, which is a history of the development in the interwar period, of naval strategy for a potential war with Japan. And basically that we don't want to have to fight a really tough, decisive, meaning extraordinarily strategically dangerous battle with the Japanese Navy after coming all the way across the Pacific to do it, because that's really wearing on both people and the ships. And it's the same problem that you just recounted with the Russians. And I'm quite sure that it's something that the U.S. Navy is thinking about today with regard to, God forbid, a war with China over Taiwan or something similar. Yeah.
I mean, okay, so here's where I'm taking
We welcome your intervention, because otherwise we'll just keep going down this rabbit hole.
This is going to sound just off the wall, but what I keep thinking in this, listening to this conversation, is because I hardly ever think about the history of war, but therefore I have weird thoughts about it. Probably. But it just sounds to me like when a person, just take a single person, when a single person doesn't recognize there's this, there's a syndrome, there's a neurological syndrome where like a person can have a stroke and they don't recognize, like a heavy neglect syndrome, where they might not recognize their right arm and they'll be like, why is this arm here all the time? I don't know whose it is, right? And then you have to work with the person to try to recognize that's your arm, and etc.
Right.
They may never get it, they may get it. But how is it that we don't, what I don't know how I want to ask this question, but it seems to me obvious that we don't see the world as us. We see the world as
we other the world.
We other the
world.
The world, and even parts of our own country we other. And so what can we work with, like cultures or political systems, in the same way you would work with a neurological patient to say, oh no, that's your arm, shows up every time because it's part of you. And look how much nicer it is when we, pay good attention to the arm and don't do bad things. So, I mean, is there a hope for not othering. And here's the weirder part of the question. Could that hope come from having an invading force from either climate as like an externalized invading force that we have to unify against, or UFOs as another externalized invading force? In other words, to what extent can we make this change happen?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. Mark's view on this, and this is not something I've studied. I'm not a political scientist, let alone that particular kind of political scientist. I literally think that probably alien invasion, which I'm fairly sure is not going to happen anytime soon, would be the one thing that could do that. I actually am very pessimistic, even that climate change could do that. Now, I don't know, 100 years from now, when things are really, really, really dire, maybe. Even then, I'm not very optimistic.
So it has to be something like that's fast and obvious.
Yes, and also in which all nations' interests are aligned. Like keeping the Martians from taking over the planet and eating all of us, everyone would be aligned on that mission, right? But even in the depths of really catastrophic climate change, in the near and midterm future, there will be winners and losers on the Earth, no matter what policy decisions we make. And I'm somebody who believes that war is something we're not ever going to get rid of as a practical matter. It's been with us, in some form or another since the dawn of time, and I think it's gonna stay with us. I think it's a tragedy, more or less, in the literal sense. But yeah, I don't have much hope for a fundamentally and enduringly peaceful world.
Wait, what evidence do we have that it's been with us since the dawn of time?
Oh, there's lots of archaeological evidence. Going way back. So, for instance, the first battle of which we have a tactical account, i.e., these people on the battlefield did this, and then these people on the battlefield did that, was from 1274 BC. And we have accounts
the
of battles.
The Egyptians against the Syrians or something like that?
It was the Hittites versus the
Hittites.
Assyrians, I think, if I recall correctly. Do not quote me on that. I know it was the Battle of Kadesh or Kadesh, but yeah. And we have archaeological evidence, long before that. And also anthropologists get in on this as well, because what they discover, and again, I'm, well beyond my field of expertise here, but what they've discovered in a lot of cultures that have not, until recently had contact with the outside world, is that in one way, shape, or form, they all engage in organized violence of some sort or another. So
has it always been mostly men?
No, well, mostly, yes. It's always been mostly men, but it is not always, and I'm not sure ever was, exclusively men.
Right.
No.
Right.
Well, I hope you're wrong.
I do too.
I do too.
And I will always argue that war is not inevitable. I was doing an earlier Pandas, I think 2 Pandas ago, where I was telling the person we were talking to how disappointed I was in Star Wars movies, because these are the most advanced, technologically advanced, they can do anything. And yet they're still having wars? What, WTF? Why is that?
Yeah, FDR said we have to invest in the science of human relations or something like that, because it's the getting along with other people that's going to basically shape the future of humanity.
Yeah, so my bet is
I completely agree.
My bet is that war will end, but it'll be an extremely long journey. It'll be a very painful journey. It won't happen in any of the lifetimes that are current here on Earth, perhaps not even many multiple generations. But
yeah,
I think, humans are very clever, and we're more and more clever in ways of hurting ourselves and destroying others. And I think eventually we'll have to use the cliche, pay the piper. Eventually this will run its course in some way.
Yeah.
I hope you're right. But yes, I completely agree with you that none of us or anybody even remotely related to us downstream is going to see that future. And I would say that while I personally believe that war as a phenomenon is a permanent feature rather of humanity. I don't believe that any given war is inevitable. I don't believe much of anything actually is inevitable outside, the laws of physics, the Newtonian ones, not the quantum ones. And so, so I think striving for solving specific problems that might lead to war and striving for a system in which war is turned to, at the very least, less often is an entirely virtuous product, which I think can and has paid real dividends, in our lifetimes. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and we have to work. I mean, so I have to put out the hope and the belief that we could be wrong, and also we have to work towards a goal that may be generations away. I mean, so
I would say just because the goal is generations away doesn't mean we shouldn't start working on it right now.
It's selfish to be like, well, we won't see it, so it doesn't matter.
I'm not going to plant that tree.
No, I completely agree with that, and so that sparks the thought in my mind. Boy, I wish the people who brought about the Industrial Revolution had been thinking about the atmosphere at the time.
Of course, yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
we'd be in a fundamentally different world if they had.
About killing. I mean, so like, could it, when we talk about, is war about just othering? In other words, if no one else was killed in future wars, but data was stolen.
Oh.
Right. Is that a war? Like massive data theft? Is that a war?
Yeah.
And is what is that? If you say that war is part of humanity, what is that? Is that othering is part of humanity? Is it that tribalism is part of humanity? Like, what is the underlying thing?
Yeah, well, I'm not really entitled to answer those last two immediate questions. I guess I'd say two things. One, I believe that there's going to be an important caveat on this, but one, I believe that human beings are at their core fundamentally not very nice.
Mark,
that's not.
And I was telling Julia, you're such a nice person.
However, society and in all of its cultural aspects typically constrains us and trains us to be better. But I would also say that it's pretty clear that individual human behavior does not scale up to the international level. The behavior of peoples when they lump together as nations of millions of people and then create governments, however it is that they do it, a relatively quite small group of people who have to make decisions, who operate on incentives that don't affect you and me in our day-to-day lives. They're just not really comparable in my view. So and the other question, getting to like what is war? I mean, I kind of go with Clausewitz here, and he didn't quite frame it exactly this way. He did frame it this way. He didn't say it this way. That war is, by definition, he would say, instrumental, i.e., for some sort of political purpose. Now, political may be construed very broadly. I want to steal your stuff, or my country wants to steal your country's stuff, for instance. So instrumental and violent, and that a variety of unpleasant things can happen that don't meet one or the other, or indeed both of those criteria. But I would argue that war is both instrumental for a purpose and violent, and violent ultimately means killing people and or breaking things.
All right, enough of this subject. Okay,
I mean, I can argue on the Anne Frank thing with you forever.
But we're not going to get we're not going to make a whole lot of progress on this, or progress isn't the right word.
Well,
but
can I perhaps help you with the transition a little bit? I would observe. So first off, I'm an intelligence historian, but I live on the borderlands of military history. And I would say that certainly military historians are not an optimistic lot by nature, but also I would argue, and perhaps connecting more with some of the things you want to talk about, Carmen, I think intelligence analysts, which is my background, and now I study, among other things, intelligence analysts in the past. Intelligence analysts by nature are pretty darn pessimistic too.
Yes, they are.
Right. They could always give them a, a set of data, and they can always come up with 37 things that could go very badly wrong.
If a policymaker wants to know why he or she can't make any progress in the world, an intelligence analyst is ready to offer him any number of reasons, right?
Can we
That's
talk
exactly
about,
right.
are you all interested in talking about that? Like how the intelligence community needs to be retrained to focus at least a little bit on opportunities or positive sort of
And can I,
strategy?
I think that's a great question. And can I just throw another one out? Relating to your book, you were writing about intelligence more than 100 years ago, but what are the themes or observations that you could make up, that you made about intelligence more than 100 years ago that you believe still resonate today?
Yeah.
Is that fair?
My only concern is those questions go in a rather different directions. So,
you have an agile mind. Just go
well,
for it.
On the question of intelligence analysis to support, opportunities,
Yes.
I have a thought or two on that. I would say that I feel like I'd be carrying coals to Newcastle, sitting here and discussing that with Carmen Medina, but I guess I would say, and this is speculation on my part, but I sort of wonder if, in a cultural sense, the U.S. intelligence community might start at a disadvantage. That getting to the place where that is a normal, ingrained mental process of intelligence analysts that translates into, normal intelligence products that actually are useful to people, that we may possibly be at a little bit of a disadvantage here, because the United States intelligence community, if you think about probably the two most seminal events in it, or that it underwent, were Pearl Harbor. I mean, we didn't have an intelligence community as such that at that time, but CIA and the community was invented in part to prevent another Pearl Harbor, and then of course 9/11. In other words, we are shaped in so much of our thinking and our organization by preventing surprise attack, preventing very bad things from happening. Right? That's a fundamentally pessimistic approach to the problem. And I wonder, and I don't know, but I wonder if intelligence communities in countries which are not shaped by the intelligence communities that are not shaped by such events in other countries, if perhaps they might be at a more advantageous starting point for thinking about such things.
Well,
now, there'd be many other factors in play, but
if I may interject here, you remind me of, I have a very good friend who is a Kiwi from New Zealand. He's been an ambassador. He served as ambassador to Russia twice in the last 10 years. So a very competent guy. And one of the lessons he taught me is that the world looks very different when you're a small to medium power country. So the US, for you, the world is like this problem, you're the hammer, there's all these nails, oh my God, I can't keep up. If you're like representing New Zealand, you can't operate that way. You don't have the freedom of movement, of maneuver that supposedly a country like the US has. And so they have to operate very differently, and they have to always think in terms of opportunity.
Well, yeah, that's a really great point. I hadn't thought of that in this context, but I think that makes a lot of sense to me, that in many ways, that might be the most useful, more of the time kind of thing that their intelligence communities can do, because the elephants are stomping around and like there's nothing they can do to influence that. Little they can do to influence that. That's a very interesting thought. I'll have to chew on that one for a while.
That brings us exactly to the other question, which is, in a world that is, clearly multipolar, at least, right? We are so used to like having the job of, as the US, let's reinforce our dominance, reinforce our dominance, reinforce our dominance. That trains us into this react mode and don't think longer term, don't think strategically about how we can develop friendships and create opportunities. So maybe that's another argument for thinking that way. In other words, we have to learn how to think like not the alpha dog a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense, but I would quibble with you in one way that up at least until the Trump administration, the United States has been very, very good at putting together, whether it's literally alliances like NATO or trade organizations or informal partnerships, even tacit ones. We're very good at helping countries rather get on our bandwagon. We've been exemplary at that. And you compare, say, the Soviet Union and Russia today, for that matter, for much the same reasons. They sucked at it. They were horrible at it. But we built this post-war structure of military and economics and the United Nations and all of this. And by and large, we built it in a way, unsurprisingly, that served our interests. Doesn't necessarily mean it was a bad way in some sort of moral or ethical sense, but we built it in a way that served our interests. I'm not sure that for a variety of reasons, but I think fundamentally sort of skepticism about whether to what extent and in what ways the United States should engage with the broader world. I'm not sure that's going to necessarily continue. But up until the last few years, I think the U.S. has been probably better than anybody ever was. I mean, I was thinking for a moment about the British Empire, but that was different.
Yeah,
they weren't making partnerships.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, well, fundamentally different kind of relationship.
But that's the thing is like I knew that's an opportunity to forge those alliances, and that kind of like comes from the like we're gonna share our largesse sort of attitude. But there can be other opportunities that are like, hey, we don't have much largesse to share right now, but what about how things are going to look 10 years down the road? What can we do strategically?
Let me interject here. China, 25 years from now, will they have a vibrant network of allies?
Right.
Or not? I mean, I know this is not your area of expertise, but since I don't have a PhD, I never even worry about my area of expertise. I just go right in there and say whatever I want. It's refreshing, Mark.
I know. I totally get that. Well, the answer is I'm not sure, which is always a safe answer about the future. I mean, on the one hand, they've proved to be much better at this than the Soviets were, I think.
That's already, I think, to me, an interesting observation that you really see a gap there.
Yeah, I really do. I mean, since China kind of came out of its shell in actually quite recent years. On the other hand, a lot of countries around the world in the developing world are finding China to be kind of predatory in kind of neo-colonial kinds of ways. And so that is not a good sign for them being able to build enduring networks of relationships, let alone actual alliances around the globe. But that is something that they could change. And it's also not clear how important that factor is going to be. So I think there's a strong chance that 25 years from now they will have done it. But if they didn't, I won't be surprised. I'm planning on being here 25 years from now, so I'm hoping to know the answer to this someday. Anyway, that'd be my thought on this. I don't know what you think on this.
I don't know either. I mean, I have no real expertise on China. My only observation is only just tangentially related, which is that the Chinese government is conducting this unprecedented experiment on how to control people. Control, with a little c, but nevertheless very clever. And I'm fascinated to see how that turns out, because if they succeed, then I will have been wrong on many key aspects of human nature that I kind of believe in philosophically, spiritually, that
like what
that humans don't like to be controlled, right? That would be one. That humans prefer to have sort of a relaxed freedom of expression. I think these are things that humans generally have wanted to have. That's how they want to live. And what the Chinese government has done is said, look, and in fact, now they're withdrawing part of the bargain. But up until 5 years ago, what the Chinese government said, look, this is the bargain we'll make. We'll give you all the economic freedom you want, but we're going to control all the sort of social expression, political freedom, and we're going to control it to keep the lid on whatever it is that they feel they need to keep the lid on.
Yeah.
Now, of course, they're having to remove some of the economic freedom as well. So that's why I think it's a particularly parlous period for them.
Yeah, I think that
But
makes good
you know,
sense.
if they succeed, and you know, they're very scientific, the word they use, they're very much into the power of technology and monitoring. If they succeed, then it will not be a very good thing for the world. Of that I am
No.
sure.
No, I completely agree. And I also agree with your contention that, you know, human beings don't want to be controlled and they want to be able to express themselves and all that. Nonetheless, I am always bothered by the fact that we see a lot of apparent counterexamples. You know, think about the Soviet Union, for instance, right? When Stalin died, most Soviets were genuinely grieving, right?
That is, by
What's
the
that
way,
all
a
about?
tremendous movie, Death of Stalin.
Oh my God, yes.
It's like,
It's
have you seen it?
brutal.
Oh my God. I mean, it might be a little too cynical for you, but really you should try to watch it. Yes.
It's the only comedy you'll ever see, and at the end of which somebody gets shot and his body burned.
Oh my God.
Oh my God. But yeah, but you're right. They were genuinely just despairing.
But do you think, okay, so this is really interesting. I mean, it brings up the question, to what extent does self-transcendence trump the desire for freedom? I mean,
say more. I mean, I think I know how you mean that, but say more.
Militaries all over, including our military, properly use self-transcendence to try to motivate people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do.
Right.
We're going to do it as a team. Your needs matter, but not as much as the needs of the whole, the core of the goal. And if China can use the self-transcendence card in the same way it sounds like Stalin may have, like people were grieving the goal that Stalin projected, or the vision that Stalin projected. If China can use the self-transcendence card, that may trump the individual freedom card. And,
I
and
think
that's
a
something
very
we have
interesting
to
observation.
work on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting observation.
Before we run out of time or your patience, I still want you to speak about so what are the sort of lessons from your book from the period for the First World War relevant to intelligence today. And I'm also curious whether or not you can talk about any heroes, intelligence heroes during the First World War. I imagine that they would all be men. But if there is a woman figure in the First World War that you want,
points.
Bonus points, yes.
Well, I'll start with that one, and then I'll back up to sort of what are some of the lessons or enduring themes.
And the name of your book again
is World War I and the Foundations of American Intelligence.
Excellent. Yeah.
University Press of Kansas, 2023. So there were quite a lot of women who contributed in important ways to American intelligence during World War I. However, I can't point to someone you could reasonably call a hero, a woman that you could reasonably call a hero in that connection, because one, I mean, they are nonetheless a pretty small minority, but two, I don't think there's anybody who really would qualify for that moniker coming out of World War I, period, with regard to American intelligence.
Okay.
There are a lot of people who did a lot of really good things, but you should not think about it. It sounds like I'm preaching to you. It would be a mistake to think about World War I intelligence in the kinds of ways that we think about certainly World War II intelligence, but even, Cold War, right? In World War I, there were no dramatic battles like the Battle of Midway, which was enabled by this brilliant intelligent thing, right? There was nothing analogous to like saving us from the Cuban Missile Crisis because we had intel that helped. None of that sort of stuff at all. Instead, intelligence made its contribution by sort of, how to put this, soaking it into the fabric of everyday operations of the military, and to some degree also the State Department, by the way, in non-dramatic kinds of ways. Commanders suddenly had a much better understanding of what the battlefield looked like over the next hill.
And aviation must have made a huge impact there,
yes,
right?
Aviation made an enormous impact there. Absolutely, yeah. Those signals intelligence did in a way, not to understanding the geography per se, but understanding what German forces were where on that geography. SIGINT was tremendously important, both communications intelligence and electronic intelligence, particularly direction finding and traffic analysis and that sort of stuff. So I don't think there's particularly any intelligence heroes from World War I, but there were certainly women who made important contributions, and probably most important in the code breaking field. One of Herbert Yardley's leading code breakers was Edith Rickert, who'd been on the faculty at the University of Chicago. Was a Chaucer expert, if I recall correctly, but there were quite a few others as well. Also, it's interesting to note, one of the things I found in researching this book was, so the Military Intelligence Division, so War Department Intelligence here in Washington, literally all of the sort of work that went out the door, if you will, and operations in the field, to the extent they did that, were done by men. However, they needed an enormous support staff. We still do, but even more back then in the era before computers and photocopy machines and all of that. And that work was predominantly done by women. But when the Military Intelligence Division started expanding, okay, we're going to need more people to do all this support work. They didn't just pick up any warm body who happened to be walking down the street. They went to, and I'm trying to remember exactly who it was, but they went to the dean of one of the leading women's colleges. I think it was one of the Seven Sisters, and said, recruit us the smartest, best women coming, fresh out of college that you can find. So they chose, the intellectual elite among the female Americans to do that kind of work, which I think is really, really interesting.
Yes.
And I think it was a good call in my view.
And how about some lessons that resonate today?
Well, lessons. Okay. So the big one that I would say is a degree of caution about the conduct of domestic surveillance and domestic counterintelligence.
Interesting.
I would say that is, aside from the sort of more technical lessons about, like, how to do SIGINT and that sort of stuff, and analyzing aerial photography and that sort of stuff, I think that's the biggest one. So one thing I'd point to particularly is, during World War I, there was something called the American Protective League, which was founded in Chicago by 3 businessmen about 2 months, if I recall correctly, before we entered the war. And these businessmen said, looks like we're going to be at war soon. And we're sure the government is going to need some help doing investigative work and all this sort of stuff. So let's bring together the leading citizens, who were most, if not exclusively, male businessmen from around the country, to help them with this. And eventually it grew to be 250,000 people. The Justice Department gave it some sort of quasi charter, and they were used to support Justice Department operations, also domestic intelligence by military intelligence and naval intelligence. So they did things like sort of collecting rumors about, who might be a German spy, doing some initial investigative work, doing the things that today we would call a background investigation for a clearance, which wasn't applied to everybody then, but some. Also various things like rounding up slackers, which was the term for draft evaders and other sorts of things. They had offices in naval intelligence and military intelligence headquarters. They were heavily used, but even by the standards of the time, they were viewed as being too close to vigilantes. And the moment the war was over, the Justice Department said, "Thank you very much for your service. Disband immediately. Send us all your files." And then when World War II came around, and I'm trying to remember who floated this, but a proposal was made, I think to the FBI, if I recall correctly. A proposal was made at high levels in Washington why don't we recreate this? And like the answer was, hell no, we're not going to do that.
Yes.
That was a really bad idea. We shouldn't have done it in the first place, and we're not going to repeat that mistake. And secondarily, is related to that, and secondarily, the U.S. military and all the leading militaries at the time, bear with me for a minute here, had this conception of war, had this conception of war that, okay, this world war we're in is a fundamentally new kind of war. That's a war of not just of armies against each other in the battlefield and fleets against each other at sea, but of entire societies and economies and militaries against each other. So it was important to keep on top of things like civilian morale and pernicious rumors that were being spread, and to control sabotage and obviously espionage and all of these things. I ran across one document talking about how if the Germans managed to persuade, one American to avoid the draft, that man is every bit as much out of the fight as if he'd been shot in the trenches in France, right? And so if you have this conception of war, it makes, we can argue about whether that was a correct perception or not, but if you have that perception about war, which people who thought about this at the time did, then you kind of inevitably have to do a lot of surveillance of the domestic population. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting that particularly on the War Department side, on military intelligence, but to some degree also on naval intelligence, the moment the war was over, everybody was gung-ho about that while the war was on, but the moment the war was over, most officers were saying like, okay, necessary in war, we should not be doing this to any significant degree in peacetime. Mm-hmm. That I think is an important lesson. And you see echoes of that, in some ways carrying on to today. So exactly. Lord knows there is definitely pretty robust domestic intelligence collection these days.
No, but
that feeling continues.
It's encouraging to hear that that's been the tradition. It's an interesting contrast to China. And I'm glad that you've mentioned this, because one of the things that we encounter a lot when we talk about intelligence is this crazy conspiratorial theory that many Americans very casually have, which is that the Defense Department and the intelligence community operate completely outside the law, do whatever they want, and know everything that I'm doing all the time. And
all of which is wrong.
All of which is wrong, but which is just casually believed by, I would say, half the American people.
Yeah, and it is the case that you sure go into practically every restaurant and even my dentist office, and there's like multiple cameras watching you, and then your cell phone is watching. There is sort of there is some communication that needs to happen around who is running those cameras, and that in fact private businesses. So
do you prefer private business or government to run those cameras?
Well,
it's interesting because in Europe, the EU, generally speaking, prefers government to be running those cameras. And in the US, it's hell no.
We don't want anyone running.
We don't want anyone, but for sure we don't want government running the cameras.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. I was just going to say that. I think that's a function ultimately of the philosophy of the founders, right? We are the country that rejected kings and powerful governments, and it's fundamentally, I guess the real point is like, we were founded on the distrust of government, right? That is at the fundamental level of the American constitutional system. Yep. And we see that today, right? The Canadians are the ones who are happy to continue having a king. The Brits were happy to continue having a king. We were the ones who were like, hell no. Right. So I think to my mind, it makes sense that we see the phenomenon you just described, the dichotomy of how Europeans tend to think about this and about Americans tend to think. The other thing I think about frequently, too, is that the way things are today, and again, that may change soon, but the way things are today, I am much less worried about the government surveilling me than I am about, Google or whoever. Because, the government can make my life a whole lot more miserable than Google can. They can put me in prison. They could even theoretically have me executed. But as a practical matter, that ain't gonna happen. Right? They can't kill me. as a reasonably speaking, they can't kill me. They certainly can't put me in prison. But they can try and indeed succeed at manipulating my life in ways that are, potentially pretty darn profound. Right? The commercial surveillance industry is all about literally acting on us. And most of the government surveillance that happens is about knowing if we do anything bad and ignoring us otherwise.
So any other lessons? So I have one last pop quiz question that straight out of today's headlines.
I don't know about any other lessons from World War I. I mean, my fundamental point I make in the book, just briefly, is that while we tend to think of the origins of modern American intelligence with the National Security Act of 1947, the creation of the CIA, and sort of the introductory chapter is the OSS, right? That all makes sense if you're thinking about more or less the current lineup of agencies and the current legal structures. But if you're looking at what individual intelligence personnel do, the subdisciplines, if you will, of intelligence, of conducting espionage operations and breaking codes and doing analysis and counter-espionage and all that stuff, even covert action, actually, that's all there by the end of World War I. And everything else that came was sort of putting that in different contexts or maturing abilities to do that, or sometimes de-emphasizing some of them, like the domestic counterintelligence stuff. And it's sort of circling back to what I said earlier. I mean, that an intelligence officer of November 1918, an American, could have a pretty decent professional conversation with an OSS officer or a CIA officer or those sorts of things.
Very good.
But anyway, that's not a lesson per se. It's more an observation. That's one of the big takeaways in my book.
There's my pop quiz.
Okay.
Putin fired his defense minister today. What's up?
Yeah.
What do you think?
So there was a time when I could claim to be more, somewhat of a Russia expert. That time has passed. So with that caveat, I mean, in one sense, I don't find it tremendously surprising because Shoigu has presided over a not especially successful war. On the other hand, Shoigu and Putin go back a long way, and I think Shoigu, in my view, was out of his depth running the MOD. But I watched him actually as far back as the mid '90s when he was Minister for Emergency Situations in Russia, and he was an extraordinarily capable guy, sort of in that kind of field, and had turned it into much more of a platform for political clout than one might imagine, right? The director of FEMA in the United States is not a big political player, okay? But he was a non-trivial one at any rate. So I think he got out of his depth. So in that sense, I'm not surprised. If anything, I'm a little surprised it took that long. I would hypothesize that it's because he and Putin go way back. If you buy that, then whoever he's replaced with, and I know it's this Belousov guy whose background is economics, and I know nothing about him, but getting rid of the incompetent guy at the top of the war effort is probably not good news for the Ukrainians. So that's my minimally informed take on things. You probably both of you are better entitled to an opinion than I am.
Not me.
Although I have my intuitive thoughts that he was doing him a favor.
That Putin was doing him a favor?
Yeah.
That's a very interesting thought. That's probably right, I think. Yeah.
Right. That he was a loyal soldier to Putin for a long time, and
get him out of the mix.
While
the gun's good.
Yeah.
That's a good thought. I'd buy that.
Oh, it was great to talk to you, Mark.
And you. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
I really enjoyed it. Is there anything else that any other so we return to whether or not war is inevitable? No.
I mean, I have been educated and fascinated by this conversation. I do want to talk more with you at some point about that.
Happy to do that.
Dig into why you think that's inevitable and what it is about the human heart that makes that so.
Yeah, Mark, it's difficult just to reflect on my own career and my own the way I think about this. You cannot be a successful. I don't think you can be a a successful intelligence officer, certainly, you know, of any rank, and not be a realist. You just can't. It's just never going to work out for you.
But what's
and yet, well, no, and let me just say, and yet, I have never lost my hope that the dynamic will someday be transformed.
Mm-hmm.
And when I talk to young kids at universities, which I still sometimes do, one of the things that I will say very passionately is never, never let the people today, the so-called experts, tell you that there is no other way to conduct foreign policy and that there is no other way to protect our national security. Don't accept it. I know it's hard, but we have to keep trying to get to some other place. And that is my complete, honest belief.
Yeah.
So I have to be a realist, you know, we have to kill some people, you know, some really bad things end up happening. But I think that those are, I don't know what the right word to use, because all words are bad, you know, expedient, you know, temporizing. I don't know what to say.
Yeah, it would clearly be a much worse world. As bad as the world is now, we'd clearly be in a much worse one if people didn't have that you know, approach, that mindset that you just laid out. Absolutely. I really, really would not want to live in that world.
Yeah, that's right.
I agree. But what I feel like you have to acknowledge is that these aren't mutually exclusive. It's all time frame. You're a short-term realist. So a good intelligence professional has to be a short-term realist, but a long-term optimist. You have to have something to work towards that's of the good, that in your mind you believe could actually change. But at the same time, you have to deal with what's true now, right?
And that's where that's where the rub is. That's where we fall into a problem or a pit of despair, when we are both we are short-term realist and sort of long-term Eeyores.
Mm-hmm.
That's not that. You may be able to sustain that pattern indefinitely, but it's never going to get you anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Never.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's probably right. If by you mean the overall system of the country and then the international community.
We're never going to get to, we're never, we're never going to progress to the next stage. I'm not sure, what people like to say is that the arrow of time, or whatever that saying is, points toward justice. And I'm
like, the arc of history bends towards justice.
There points toward justice. And I'm like, I'm not so sure, really. But I have to pretend that it does.
I think that's right.
You're sure?
I'm sure. It's all about how long is that arc?
Yeah.
Yeah. And let me also thank you for introducing me to the phrase long-term Eeyore, which I will have to use in the future. It sounds like a very useful phrase.
Yes, there you go.